So how do organisms reproduce? It's a huge question, right? It's one of the most fundamental processes in all of biology. It's the one thing that connects every single living thing from the tiniest bacteria to the biggest blue whale. Today, we're going to explore this essential story of life itself. But let's start with an even more basic question. Why even bother? I mean, think about it. Unlike eating or breathing, an organism doesn't actually need to reproduce to stay alive. It takes a ton of energy. So what's the point? Well, while it's not crucial for an individual's survival, it is absolutely essential for the survival of an entire species. So here's our game plan. We'll kick things off by looking at the blueprint for all life. Then, we'll dive into the world of asexual reproduction, check out how plants use a different strategy to create new life, and finally, we'll get into the story of human reproduction and health. Okay, let's jump into our first section, the blueprint for life. At the very heart of all creation, there's a fundamental set of instructions that basically dictates how every living thing is built. And that blueprint is, you guessed it, DNA. The best way to think about it is like a super detailed instruction manual tucked away inside the nucleus of every cell. It has all the info for building the proteins that create an organism's unique body design. So you can see why the most basic event in any kind of reproduction is making a copy of this DNA. All right, so step one is copying the DNA. But that leads to a really important question. Is that copying process always perfect? Are the copies always 100% exact? Well, the short answer is no. You see, no biochemical process is absolutely flawless. When DNA gets copied, there are bound to be some tiny errors, what we call variations. This means the new DNA copies are really similar to the original, but not always identical. And these subtle differences are the source of something incredibly important: variation. And this is where things get really interesting for survival. Imagine a bunch of bacteria just chilling in some water. Now, what if the temperature suddenly shoots up? Most of them might die off, but what if a few of them have a tiny variation that happens to make them heat resistant? Well, they survive, they reproduce, and they pass on that awesome trait. This is why variation isn't just a mistake, it's the engine of evolution, and it's absolutely vital for a species to survive in the long run.
So now that we've got that foundation down, let's check out the simplest way to reproduce. Just making a direct copy. Welcome to the world of asexual reproduction.
Asexual reproduction is pretty straightforward. You get a new generation from just a single parent. This means the offspring are essentially clones. They're genetically very similar to that one parent. Let's look at a few ways this can happen. First up, we have fission, which is super common for single-celled organisms. On one hand, you've got binary fission. Think of an amoeba. The cell just splits right down the middle into two equal halves. Simple. But on the other hand, you have multiple fission, which you see in things like the malaria parasite, Plasmodium. Here, one cell divides into many daughter cells all at once. Pretty different strategies for splitting up. Next, there's budding. Organisms like Hydra are pros at this. Just imagine the parent organism growing a little mini-me called a bud right on its body. This bud grows and develops into a tiny, complete individual. And once it's mature enough, it just pops off and starts a new life all on its own. Okay, now for something that sounds like it's straight out of science fiction: regeneration. Creatures like the flatworm planaria have a mind-blowing superpower. If you cut one into several pieces, each and every piece can grow back into a complete new worm. How cool is that? They can do this because they have these specialized cells that can multiply and rebuild any body part. But it's important to remember, this isn't how they normally reproduce. They don't rely on being chopped up to make more of themselves. And finally, let's talk about spore formation. You've definitely seen this with things like bread mold. Those fuzzy growths often have these tiny dark dots on stalks, right? Well, those are called sporangia, and they're like little capsules packed with reproductive cells called spores. Each spore has a tough, protective wall, which lets it survive pretty much anything until it finds a nice, moist spot to land and start growing. And now for a plot twist. If making simple copies is so efficient, why on earth did a much more complex method evolve? Let's explore the power of combination in sexual reproduction, starting with plants. In flowering plants, the flower is where all the action is. The key players here are the stamen, which is the male part that produces all the tiny pollen grains, and the pistil, the female part you'll find right in the center, which holds the egg cells. The whole journey of creating a seed happens in 4 main steps. First, pollination. This is just getting the pollen from the stamen to the sticky top of the pistil, which is called the stigma. Second, fertilization. This is when the male germ cell from the pollen travels down and fuses with the female egg cell. Third,
This fusion creates a fertilized egg, also called a zygote. And finally, development. The zygote grows into an embryo, the ovule turns into a seed, and the ovary around it ripens into a fruit.
Now that first step, pollination, can happen in two ways. There's self-pollination, where pollen just moves around within the same flower. But then you have cross-pollination, which is a game changer for creating more genetic variation. That's when pollen travels from one flower to a totally different one, usually with the help of agents like the wind, water, or animals like bees and birds.
All right, let's bring it all home to our final section and see how all these principles apply to the species we know best, us. This is the human story of reproduction.
For humans, the journey to being able to reproduce all starts with puberty. This is that time during your teen years when the body kind of shifts gears from general growth to focusing on developing the reproductive system. It's the biological bridge that takes you from childhood to adulthood.
And a lot of changes happen during puberty. Some are common for everybody, like new hair growing in the armpits and genital area, and skin getting a bit oilier. But other changes are more specific. For girls, breast size increases and menstruation starts. For boys, thick hair begins to grow on the face and their voices start to crack. All these changes are just signals that the body is getting ready for sexual maturation.
This whole maturation process happens inside the reproductive systems. The male system, which we see on the left, is built to produce and deliver male germ cells, or sperm, and those are made in the testes. The female system on the right is designed to produce female germ cells, or eggs, in the ovaries, and also to nurture a developing life. So, if a sperm cell manages to fertilize an egg cell, a brand new journey begins. The fertilized egg, now an embryo, travels to the uterus and implants itself in the wall. Over the next 9 months, it develops into a fetus, getting all its oxygen and nutrients from the mother's blood through a special tissue called the placenta. And that whole journey ends with birth, which is triggered by rhythmic contractions of the uterus.
Now, because the sexual act can lead to pregnancy, which is obviously a huge responsibility, it's really important to understand reproductive health. There are many ways to avoid a pregnancy, and these are called contraceptive methods. They fall into a few categories. You've got mechanical barriers, like condoms, hormonal methods, like pills, devices that are placed in the uterus, like a copper T, and even surgical methods.
So we've seen how reproduction ensures the biological survival of a species, but that kind of leaves us with a bigger question, doesn't it? For humans, living in these complex societies, what does it take to ensure not just our survival, but the well-being and health of our species? Definitely something to think about.